Hey guys, tonight we begin with medieval emergency fixes, the kind invented at 3 in the morning while a city was burning and people were coughing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Quarantine was not invented by doctors, scientists, or anyone wearing a reassuring white coat. It was invented by medieval officials staring at a city full of corpses and saying, "All right, something is clearly happening here. No microscopes, no medical textbooks, just a horrifying pattern and a strong desire to stop digging graves." Medieval port cities noticed it first. A ship arrived. Everyone got excited. Trade resumed. And then, within days, people started coughing in a way that suggested this was not going to end well. Bells rang. Streets emptied. Someone inevitably said, "This didn't happen before the ship showed up." And just like that, humanity stumbled into epidemiology by accident. The solution was simple, brutal, and deeply medieval: delay everything. Ships were ordered to sit offshore and think about what they'd done. Travellers were kept outside city walls like socially awkward guests who arrived too early. Goods were left untouched, as if disease respected personal space and needed time to calm down. The famous 40-day waiting period wasn't sacred. It wasn't scientific. It was long enough for someone to start looking suspiciously unwell. If no one died after 40 days, congratulations, you were probably safe. If someone did, well, the problem often solved itself before paperwork became necessary. Being quarantined was miserable. You weren't sick, but you weren't trusted either. Food was delivered at arm's length. Guards watched you like you were a walking mistake. Conversations happened from across open spaces, shouted loudly enough for fear to echo back. Imagine being lonely, bored, and aware that everyone secretly hoped you'd either recover quickly or leave history quietly. Inside the city, quarantine created the illusion of control. People believed walls and waiting could protect them, which was comforting even when it wasn't entirely true. But sometimes it did work. Fewer people died. Panic slowed. Order returned just enough for everyone to pretend things were under control. And here's the important part. It worked often enough to be remembered. Quarantine stopped being a desperate emergency measure and slowly became policy. Observation turned into tradition. Tradition hardened into law. What began as medieval improvisation became the backbone of modern public health. Today, quarantine sounds clinical, responsible, organized. Back then, it was closer to, "Stand over there, don't touch anything, we'll see what happens." Not elegant, not kind, but effective enough to survive 800 years. Bureaucracy wasn't invented because medieval rulers loved forms, folders, or the quiet joy of alphabetical order. It was invented because during emergencies, everyone started shouting at once, and nothing worked. When wars broke out, harvests failed, or plagues emptied cities, medieval governments faced a terrifying realization. If nothing was written down, reality itself became optional. In early crises, rulers relied on memory and verbal commands. This went about as well as you'd expect. Who owed taxes? No one remembered. Who had already paid? Also unclear. Who owned which land now that half the village had fled or died? Excellent question. Arguments multiplied faster than rabbits with ambition, so officials reached for the most powerful tool available: ink. Lists appeared. Ledgers were created. Names were recorded. Properties were described in exhausting detail. Suddenly, survival required paperwork. This wasn't administration for efficiency's sake, it was damage control. When society started unraveling, writing things down was the only way to keep it from completely melting into chaos. Census records emerged not because rulers cared deeply about demographics, but because they needed to know who was still alive. Tax rolls weren't about fairness. They were about making sure someone, anyone, was still funding the kingdom. Court records multiplied because relying on witnesses during mass panic proved unreliable. Shockingly, frightened people lie. The medieval clerk became a quiet emergency worker. While soldiers fought and doctors failed heroically, clerks sat hunched over desks documenting reality so it didn't disappear. They preserved order with ink-stained fingers and a deep resentment toward anyone who said, "Can't you just remember?" People hated bureaucracy immediately. Forms were confusing, rules felt arbitrary, officials were slow. Nothing has changed. But bureaucracy had one unbeatable advantage. It worked when everything else stopped working. Once emergencies passed, the paperwork didn't disappear. Records proved useful. Written agreements reduced fights. Lists prevented duplication. Slowly, reluctantly, bureaucracy became permanent. What started as medieval panic management evolved into modern administration. Every permit, license, application, and government form traces its lineage back to a time when rulers realized that yelling orders into a crowd of terrified people produced nothing but louder yelling. So yes, bureaucracy is annoying. Yes, it feels pointless. But it exists because medieval societies learned that chaos is far worse. And somewhere in history, a tired clerk just nodded and kept writing. Before emergencies forced everyone to cooperate, time in the medieval world was a suggestion, a flexible concept, a personal opinion. Noon happened when the sun felt like it was roughly overhead, and everyone politely agreed not to ask further questions. This worked fine, until something urgent happened and people needed to show up at the same moment. When cities faced attacks, fires, curfews, or food shortages, vague timekeeping became a liability. Meet at dawn was useless if dawn meant different things to different people. Bells rang early. Bells rang late. Bells rang whenever the bell ringer felt like it. Chaos followed. Sometimes literal chaos, sometimes just a lot of yelling. So medieval cities did something revolutionary. They standardized time, not out of scientific curiosity, but out of sheer frustration. If the city was going to defend itself, pray together, close gates, or distribute food, everyone needed to agree on when those things happened. Church bells became the backbone of timekeeping. Fixed hours were established. Bells rang at set intervals. Miss the bell, and that was your fault, not the sun's. Mechanical clocks followed. Large, inaccurate, expensive machines that still did one thing better than nature. They were consistent. And consistency, during emergencies, was everything. Standard time allowed guards to change shifts reliably. Markets opened and closed on schedule. Curfews could be enforced without arguments about shadows. Coordinated responses became possible. People still complained, but now they complained on time. Of course, no one liked this at first. Standardized time felt intrusive. People resented being told when to wake, work, pray, eat, and sleep. It felt unnatural, because it was. Medieval life had always flowed with daylight and seasons, not with bells screaming instructions at you from a tower. But once adopted, time discipline never left. It was too useful. Cities functioned better. Authority became easier to enforce. Emergencies became manageable instead of frantic. Fast forward a few centuries, and here we are. We schedule everything. We measure productivity by minutes. We panic if our phone battery dies because suddenly time becomes ambiguous again. And ambiguity makes us uncomfortable. All because medieval people once said, "We need everyone to show up now, not roughly later." Standard time didn't make life better. It made life controllable. And in emergencies, control always wins. Medieval cities did not invent street cleaning because they cared about beauty, comfort, or the emotional well-being of pedestrians. They invented it because the streets smelled like a warning sign. When disease arrived, filth arrived first. And when filth stayed, death followed close behind like an unwanted companion who refused to leave. For most of the Middle Ages, streets were multi-purpose spaces. People walked there, worked there, traded there, and very enthusiastically dumped waste there. Household trash, Animal droppings, butcher scraps, and whatever else needed to disappear were all generously contributed to the street. Rain was expected to deal with it eventually. Rain did not cooperate. Then came outbreaks, and suddenly officials noticed something curious. Neighborhoods drowning in waste were also the neighborhoods filling graveyards. No one understood bacteria, but medieval people were excellent at noticing patterns when the consequences were severe enough. So cities responded with what passed for emergency hygiene. Orders were issued. Residents were told to clear refuse. Gutters were dug. Waste was pushed away from living areas and toward rivers, pits, or the edge of town, which, to be fair, just moved the problem somewhere else, but at least it wasn't here anymore. This was not polite sanitation. This was aggressive cleanliness fueled by fear. Fines were imposed for dumping waste improperly. Entire streets were ordered to clean themselves at once, which was less coordinated than it sounds and involved a lot of yelling. People complained loudly about the inconvenience, which is comforting because nothing about human nature has changed. Street cleaning worked just well enough to matter. Areas that removed waste saw fewer outbreaks. The smell lessened. Insects retreated. People stopped dying quite so fast. And once something reduces death, even slightly, it tends to stick around. Over time, emergency cleanups became routine. Cities hired workers specifically to remove waste. Rules became permanent. Infrastructure followed. Gutters turned into sewers. What began as medieval officials shouting, "Get rid of that before we all perish," quietly evolved into modern sanitation systems. Today we associate clean streets with order and safety. Back then, cleanliness wasn't about pride. It was about survival. A foul-smelling street wasn't just unpleasant. It was a sign that something worse was coming. So medieval street cleaning wasn't about making cities nice. It was about making them less deadly. And every time you walk down a clean sidewalk, you're benefiting from medieval people learning the hard way that rot and civilization should not share the same space. Medieval cities learned about fire the same way people learn not to touch a hot stove, by touching it repeatedly, and then acting surprised when everything caught fire again. Wood, thatch, narrow streets, open flames, and constant wind formed a perfect partnership dedicated to total urban destruction. A single spark could erase an entire neighborhood. One careless hearth, one overturned candle, one bakery getting a little too ambitious. And suddenly the city was on fire in a way that felt personal. Flames jumped from roof to roof like they had a schedule. People didn't evacuate calmly. They ran, screamed, and tried to save items that, in hindsight, were deeply replaceable. After rebuilding the same cities for the third or fourth time, medieval authorities reached a revolutionary conclusion. Maybe this keeps happening for a reason. Emergency rules followed. Thatched roofs were banned in certain areas. Stone and tile were encouraged or forcibly required. Buildings had to be spaced apart, not for aesthetics, but to give fires fewer opportunities to socialize. Hearths were regulated. Chimneys were inspected. Open flames were suddenly everyone's business. These weren't thoughtful urban reforms. They were trauma responses. People hated the rules. Stone was expensive. Tile was heavy. Spacing buildings meant giving up valuable land. Artisans complained. Landowners complained louder. Everyone complained until the next fire arrived and reminded them why the rules existed. Fire codes worked. Not perfectly, but noticeably. Fires still happened, but they didn't consume entire cities with the same enthusiasm. Neighborhoods survived. Insurance systems eventually emerged. Rebuilding became manageable instead of constant. And once again, the emergency fix stayed. Modern fire codes, sprinkler systems, building materials, spacing regulations, inspections, all trace their lineage back to medieval officials trying to stop cities from reenacting the same disaster every generation. The language changed. The enforcement improved. The frustration remained. We now think of fire safety as common sense. Medieval people thought of it as annoying interference until everything burned down again. Fire codes didn't make medieval cities safe. They made them survivable. And every time a building inspection annoys you, remember, it exists because someone, centuries ago, watched their entire city burn, and said, "Never again, or at least not this badly." Medieval hospitals were not places you went to get better. They were places you went so everyone else wouldn't get worse. Healing was optional. Containment was the goal. When plagues and epidemics swept through medieval cities, officials faced a familiar problem. Sick people were everywhere, and healthy people were becoming sick simply by standing too close. No one understood germs, but everyone understood proximity. Being near the sick was bad. Being far away felt safer. So medieval cities invented a solution that was less medical breakthrough and more strategic relocation. Hospitals were created as holding areas, places to put the ill, the injured, the contagious, and sometimes just the inconveniently coughing. These buildings were often outside city walls, downwind, or tucked into corners where no one important had to look at them. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was triage on a societal scale. Inside these early hospitals, care was basic at best. Patients were fed, prayed over, and occasionally treated with remedies that ranged from mildly helpful to actively alarming. But the real function of the hospital wasn't curing disease, it was slowing its spread. If sick people were concentrated in one place, the rest of the city could keep functioning. Markets stayed open, guards stayed healthy, authority remained intact. People were terrified of hospitals. Being sent there felt like exile with extra coughing. Families avoided them until they couldn't. Once inside, patients were largely on their own, tended by religious orders, volunteers, or people with limited options and strong stomachs. And yet, it worked. Not perfectly, not kindly, but enough to matter. Cities with designated care spaces saw fewer uncontrolled outbreaks. Panic eased. Death became organized instead of chaotic, which sounds grim, but organization was progress. Over time, something unexpected happened. Knowledge accumulated. Care improved. People noticed which practices helped and which made things worse. Hospitals slowly shifted from isolation centers into places of treatment. Emergency containment evolved into medicine. Modern hospitals are clean, scientific, and designed for recovery. But their ancestor was a medieval decision that went something like, put the sick over there, away from us, preferably behind a wall. Not elegant, not compassionate by modern standards, but effective enough to change history. Hospitals exist today because medieval societies learned that separating illness from daily life was the first step toward surviving it. In a medieval emergency, confusion was often more dangerous than the crisis itself. Fires, riots, invasions, outbreaks, all of them shared one fatal weakness. Nobody knew who to listen to. When everyone is shouting instructions at once, authority dissolves into noise. Medieval cities discovered this the hard way, usually while something important was burning. Early on, authority relied on reputation. That man is in charge. Worked fine, until you couldn't recognize that man in a crowd of terrified people running in every direction. During chaos, titles meant nothing if they weren't visible. So medieval societies did something brilliantly simple. They dressed authority differently. Guards wore specific colors. Town officials carried distinctive symbols. Messengers had recognizable clothing. Soldiers were marked clearly, so civilians knew who was allowed to yell orders without being punched in the face. Uniforms weren't about style. They were visual shortcuts for obedience. This was especially critical during emergencies. If a fire broke out, people needed to know instantly who was directing evacuations. If a curfew was enforced, citizens had to recognize enforcement without debate. When plague hit, uniformed officials could deliver orders without stopping to prove their identity every 5 minutes. Uniforms replaced explanation. And it worked. People followed visible authority more readily, not because they trusted it, but because uncertainty was worse. A uniform meant someone had permission to act. In panic situations, that alone was enough. Of course, people resented uniforms immediately. They always have. Uniforms symbolize control, and humans famously dislike being controlled. right up until things fall apart. Then suddenly everyone wants very clear instructions from someone who looks official. Over time, uniforms became permanent. City guards kept them. Guild officials adopted them. Military clothing standardized. Authority stopped being personal and became institutional. You didn't obey that person. You obeyed that role. Today, uniforms still do the same job. Police, firefighters, medical staff, security. Their clothing signals authority, responsibility, and expected behavior. We respond automatically. We step aside. We listen. We comply. All because medieval people once realized that during emergencies, asking, "Who are you?" wastes time. Uniforms didn't make authority wiser. They made it visible. And in moments of chaos, visibility is often the difference between order and collapse. Medieval rulers didn't invent rationing because they enjoyed telling people no. They invented it because medieval emergencies had a habit of turning full granaries into empty promises overnight. Wars dragged on, winters overstayed their welcome, harvests failed spectacularly, and suddenly everyone wanted the same loaf of bread at the same time. This did not end well. Early on, cities tried optimism. They encouraged moderation. They asked people to be reasonable. Medieval history is very clear on how that went. When fear arrived, so did hoarding. The wealthy stockpiled. The desperate panicked. Prices exploded. Fights broke out in markets over grain that didn't exist anymore. Someone always tried to sell a sack of flour that was mostly wishful thinking. So authorities stepped in with the least popular solution imaginable: control. Rationing meant limits, fixed prices, set quantities, specific days for distribution. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't fair in the modern sense, but it prevented total collapse. If everyone got a little, fewer people starved immediately. If supplies were tracked, panic slowed. If rules existed, order followed, grudgingly. Grain was the most tightly controlled resource. Bread shortages caused riots faster than almost anything else. Medieval governments learned very quickly that hungry crowds stop respecting authority. So they regulated bakeries, monitored flour supplies, and punished hoarders harshly. Not because they cared deeply about justice, but because bread riots were inconvenient and dangerous. Fuel was rationed too. Wood, peat, charcoal, anything that kept people warm or cooking became subject to oversight during shortages. You could burn, but not excessively. You could buy, but not endlessly. Survival required restraint, whether people liked it or not. People hated rationing immediately. They complained loudly. They accused officials of favoritism. They claimed the rules were unfair, oppressive, and badly managed, which, to be fair, they often were. But rationing had one undeniable advantage. It delayed disaster. Once emergencies ended, rationing systems often stayed in place. They provided predictability. They stabilized markets. They kept prices from spiraling every time something went wrong. Modern rationing during crises, food limits, fuel restrictions, supply controls, follows the same medieval logic. When resources shrink and fear grows, unregulated freedom collapses faster than regulation ever does. Rationing isn't about control, it's about survival math. And medieval societies learned painfully that without limits, emergencies don't just kill supplies, they kill order itself. Medieval cities learned a simple truth very early on. Nothing good happens after dark. Fires started more easily. Crimes became bolder. Arguments escalated faster. And when emergencies hit, nighttime turned mild problems into full disasters, with impressive efficiency. Before curfews, medieval cities tried trust. They assumed people would behave responsibly at night. This assumption lasted exactly as long as it took for the first drunken fight, accidental fire, or panicked stampede to prove otherwise. Darkness reduced visibility, multiplied fear, and gave bad decisions a confidence boost. So cities introduced curfews. Bells rang in the evening, gates closed, and movement stopped. If you were outside after the bell, you needed a very good reason, and, I felt like it, was not accepted. Guards patrolled streets. Anyone wandering without permission was questioned, detained, or encouraged to reconsider their life choices. Curfews weren't about morality, they were about containment. When fewer people moved, fewer problems spread. Fires were easier to spot. Crime dropped. Disease transmission slowed. Authorities could actually tell who should be outside and who definitely should not. Of course, people hated curfews immediately. Night was freedom. Night was privacy. Night was when you did things you didn't want witnesses for. Being told to stay indoors felt oppressive, infantilizing, and deeply unfair, especially to people who were absolutely planning to do something stupid. But curfews worked. Cities with enforced nighttime restrictions experienced fewer fires, fewer riots, and fewer unexplained disasters. The streets grew quieter. Emergency response improved. Order returned, at least temporarily. And once again, the emergency measure stuck. Over time, curfews became standard tools for crisis management. Plagues, wars, unrest, shut down movement and chaos follow more slowly. Modern curfews use the same logic, just with better lighting and louder announcements. We still instinctively understand this rule. When something goes wrong, authorities restrict movement. Not because people are evil, but because panic spreads faster in the dark. Less movement equals fewer variables. Fewer variables equal control. Curfews don't stop emergencies, they slow them down. And medieval societies discovered that slowing chaos, even briefly, could mean the difference between recovery and collapse. So when you hear a curfew announced today, remember, you're listening to a medieval bell, still ringing centuries later, politely reminding humanity that nighttime is terrible for decision-making. For a long time, medieval society operated on a bold and deeply optimistic assumption. If someone said they knew how to do something, that was probably good enough. This worked fine for storytelling and farming advice. It worked much less well for medicine, construction, baking, and anything involving sharp tools or structural integrity. During emergencies, this optimism collapsed quickly. Untrained doctors killed patients with enthusiasm and confidence. Unqualified builders constructed houses that politely waited for winter before collapsing. Incompetent bakers produced bread that caused mass illness, riots, or both. And during crises, plagues, fires, famines, the damage multiplied. When survival depended on competence, pretending everyone was competent became inconvenient. So medieval cities intervened. Guilds were formed, not as cozy professional clubs, but as damage control mechanisms. If you wanted to practice a trade, you had to prove you knew what you were doing. You trained under a master. You followed rules. You demonstrated skill. If you failed, you were politely told to stop before you harmed anyone else. This wasn't about excellence. It was about reducing casualties. Medical licensing began as an attempt to stop people from experimenting on neighbors during plagues. Building standards emerged after too many emergency shelters collapsed. Food regulations followed repeated poisonings, and bread shortages that ended in violence. Licensing wasn't protectionism, it was survival. People hated it immediately. Unlicensed workers complained that rules were unfair. Masters guarded entry fiercely. Accusations of favoritism flew freely. And yes, some licensing systems became corrupt, restrictive, and frustrating, because they were run by humans. But licensing worked just well enough to stay. Cities with regulated trades experienced fewer disasters during emergencies. Buildings lasted longer. Food became safer. Treatments became less lethal. Once authorities saw measurable improvements, licensing stopped being temporary and became permanent. Modern professional certification, exams, permits, and credentials all descend from this medieval realization. Letting untrained people practice critical skills during crises is a bad idea. A very bad idea. We now take licensing for granted. We expect doctors to be trained, engineers to be certified, and food producers to follow rules. But those expectations exist because medieval societies learned, painfully, that trust me, I know what I'm doing, is not a safety standard. Professional licensing didn't create expertise, it limited disaster. And sometimes That's the best improvement civilization can manage. Medieval cities were not planned. They happened. People built where they could, added structures wherever space appeared, and stacked lives on top of lives until the result looked less like a city and more like an architectural accident. This worked fine in peaceful times. During emergencies, it was a nightmare. When fires broke out, narrow streets acted like wind tunnels. Flames leapt effortlessly from house to house, racing faster than anyone could run. When disease spread, cramped neighborhoods passed illness along like gossip. When armies approached, chaotic layouts made defense confusing and retreat worse. Walls alone were no longer enough. After repeated disasters, medieval authorities noticed something uncomfortable. The city itself was part of the problem, so emergency fixes appeared. Streets were widened, so fires had fewer places to jump. Open spaces were created to act as fire breaks and gathering points. Certain trades were pushed away from residential areas, not because of zoning aesthetics, but because tanners, butchers, and dye makers had a habit of making emergencies worse. This was urban planning born from regret. New towns were designed differently. Grids replaced winding alleys. Markets were centralized. Wells were placed strategically. Movement was controlled not for beauty, but for manageability. A city that could be navigated easily, could be defended, cleaned, and controlled during crises. People resisted, of course. Wider streets meant less building space. Relocation meant expense. Regulations felt intrusive. Medieval citizens complained that planners were ruining the character of their neighborhoods, which is comforting, because humans have complained about urban planning consistently for centuries, but the results were undeniable. Fires spread more slowly. Disease transmission decreased. Emergency responses improved. Cities recovered faster. Once officials saw that layout influenced survival, planning stopped being optional. Modern urban design still follows medieval lessons. Fire breaks, zoning laws, public squares, traffic flow, all descend from the realization that chaotic cities collapse faster under pressure. We now dress these ideas in language like efficiency and livability, but their origin is far darker. Urban planning didn't make cities pleasant. It made them survivable. And every time you complain about a one-way street or zoning restriction, remember, it exists because medieval cities once burned, sickened, and panicked themselves into understanding that space matters, especially when everything goes wrong. For a long time, medieval law existed in a wonderfully flexible state known as whatever the loudest person remembers. Rules were passed down orally, enforced inconsistently, and argued endlessly. This worked fine until emergencies arrived and everyone started shouting at once. At that point, memory failed, tempers rose, and justice became whoever had the strongest voice or the biggest weapon. During crises, plagues, riots, famines, invasions, verbal law collapsed almost immediately. People argued over obligations, rights, exemptions, and punishments. Officials contradicted each other. Witnesses remembered events differently depending on stress, fear, or personal advantage. Courts turned into theatres of confusion where facts drowned under panic. So medieval authorities reached a surprisingly modern conclusion. Write it down. Written laws didn't appear because rulers suddenly became lovers of clarity. They appeared because ambiguity was dangerous. If no one could agree on the rules during an emergency, order vanished. Written laws reduced debate. They didn't eliminate injustice, but they shortened arguments, and in crises, time mattered more than fairness. Laws were carved into stone, painted on walls, copied into books, and posted in public places. Not everyone could read, but enough people could recognize symbols, seals, and official formats to know something serious was being declared. Written law shifted authority away from memory and toward permanence. Of course, people hated this immediately. Written laws removed flexibility. You could no longer argue, "That's not how I remember it." Officials could point to text and say, "It's right there." The law became colder, more rigid, and harder to negotiate with, which was exactly the point. During emergencies, written laws allowed cities to function. Curfews were enforced consistently. Punishments were standardized. Responsibilities were clarified. Even when people disagreed with the rules, they at least knew what they were breaking. Once crises passed, written laws didn't disappear. They proved useful. They reduced disputes. They allowed systems to scale beyond personal relationships. Over time, law transformed from custom into institution. Modern legal systems still rely on this medieval realization. Memory is unreliable under stress. Writing survives panic. Courts, contracts, regulations, and constitutions all descend from medieval cities, learning that yelling rules at frightened people does not create order. Written law didn't make medieval justice fair. It made it predictable. And in emergencies, predictability often matters more than perfection. Medieval people didn't need philosophy to understand scarcity. They needed winters. A few brutal seasons were enough to teach even the most optimistic town council that hope was not a food group. When harvests failed, roads froze, and trade stopped, cities learned very quickly that relying on "we'll figure it out later" was a strategy with a high body count. Early medieval communities lived dangerously close to the edge. Grain came in once a year. Fuel was seasonal. If something went wrong, war, bad weather, disease, there was no backup plan. People simply ran out of food and then ran out of time. This happened often enough that eventually someone had the uncomfortable thought, what if we didn't eat everything immediately? Thus, emergency stockpiles were born. Granaries were built to store grain beyond immediate need. Armories stored weapons and armor so they didn't have to be produced during panic. Fuel reserves were set aside for winter and siege. These stockpiles weren't signs of prosperity. They were scars from previous disasters. Every full granary represented a famine someone remembered too clearly. Stockpiling was controversial. People hated it. Grain locked away felt unfair when mouths were hungry now. Rulers were accused of hoarding. Corruption was common. And sometimes, yes, stockpiles were mismanaged or stolen. Humans have always been excellent at ruining good ideas. But when emergencies hit, stockpiles mattered. Cities with reserves lasted longer. Sieges failed. Winters became survivable instead of fatal. Panic slowed. Planning replaced desperation, at least temporarily. The presence of stored resources also changed behavior. Knowing supplies existed reduced hoarding. Reduced hoarding reduced violence. Order followed. Not because people became kinder, but because fear loosened its grip. Over time, emergency stockpiles became permanent institutions. Cities budgeted for them. Laws protected them. Access was regulated. What began as a temporary survival measure evolved into infrastructure. Modern emergency reserves, food, fuel, medical supplies, strategic resources, follow the same medieval logic. We still prepare for disasters the same way. Store now so we don't panic later. Emergency stockpiles aren't optimistic. They're realistic. They exist because medieval societies learned the hard way that winter always arrives. Emergencies always repeat. And planning ahead beats improvising while starving. And every time a government warehouse quietly waits in the background, it's echoing a medieval lesson written in hunger and cold. Prepare now or pay later. Before public warning systems, medieval emergencies had a charming habit of arriving completely unannounced. Fires spread before anyone noticed. Enemies approached while people slept. Plagues crept in quietly. By the time danger became obvious, it was already personal. This lack of early warning cost cities dearly, and medieval communities eventually realized that surprise was their worst enemy. So they built noise. Church bells became the primary emergency broadcast system. Bells rang for fires, invasions, riots, curfews, and anything else that required immediate attention. Different rhythms meant different threats, though in practice, most people simply heard bell and assumed something terrible was happening, which, to be fair, was usually correct. Bells had one huge advantage. They didn't care who you were. Rich or poor, Awake or asleep, inside or outside, if the bell rang, you heard it. No messengers required. No explanations needed. Sound travelled faster than authority. Flags and signals followed. Towers flew warning banners. Fires were lit on hills to signal danger across long distances. Horns blasted in coordinated patterns. Medieval cities built entire communication systems designed to scream, "Something is wrong," as loudly as possible. People learned to react instinctively. Bell equals action. Drop what you're doing. Look around. Follow instructions. Panic later. Of course, false alarms happened. Someone rang the bell too early, or too late, or because a goat knocked something over and nobody wanted to admit it. People complained loudly, but even false alarms reinforced awareness. Better to panic briefly than die quietly. Over time, public warning systems became permanent. They were tested, maintained, ritualized. Bells rang for practice. Signals were standardized. Emergency communication became infrastructure. Modern sirens, alerts, emergency broadcasts, and phone notifications are direct descendants of medieval bell towers. The technology changed. The psychology didn't. Loud, unmistakable warnings still override hesitation faster than polite announcements ever could. We like to think we're more rational now. We're not. We still respond best to clear, unavoidable signals telling us to stop whatever we're doing and pay attention. Public warning systems weren't designed to inform. They were designed to interrupt. And medieval societies learned that in emergencies, interruption saves more lives than explanation. So the next time an alarm startles you, remember, you're reacting exactly as intended. Just like someone centuries ago freezing in a street, looking up at a ringing bell, and realizing that something, somewhere, had gone very wrong. Medieval rulers did not wake up one morning with a passion for taxes. They woke up to wars, invasions, collapsing defenses, empty treasuries, and the sudden realization that banners, soldiers, walls and food all cost money, immediately. And unfortunately, enthusiasm does not pay mercenaries. In calm times, taxes were predictable. Annoying, yes, but familiar. In emergencies, however, predictable revenue collapsed. Trade slowed. Harvests failed. People fled. And just when rulers needed money the most, the usual income streams quietly evaporated. So medieval governments invented a solution that still makes people groan today: emergency taxation. These weren't subtle. Special levies were announced for wars, fortifications, ransoms, crusades, and unexpected but extremely urgent situations, which somehow kept happening. Taxes were raised temporarily, at least in theory. Everyone was told it was just until the crisis passed. Everyone nodded skeptically. Emergency taxes weren't about fairness. They were about speed. Governments needed funds now, not after careful debate. Collection was aggressive. Resistance was punished. People complained loudly, which was allowed, as long as they paid first. And here's the uncomfortable part. It worked. Armies were funded, walls were repaired, supplies were purchased. Cities survived sieges that otherwise would have ended quickly and violently. Emergency taxation turned panic into action, at the cost of public goodwill, which medieval rulers considered an acceptable trade. Once the emergency ended, the tax rarely disappeared completely. Officials noticed something interesting. The system functioned. Collection networks existed. Records were kept. Revenue flowed. Why dismantle something that worked? So, temporary taxes became permanent categories. New precedents formed. Governments learned that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary funding, and that emergencies could be defined very flexibly. Modern governments still operate on this medieval logic. Special taxes, emergency budgets, crisis spending, temporary surcharges, all descend from the moment medieval rulers realized that survival requires cash and hesitation costs lives. People still hate emergency taxes. They always have. Complaints are tradition. Resistance is predictable. But emergency taxation remains one of civilization's most reliable tools when systems are under threat. Emergency taxes didn't make governments popular. They made them solvent, and once a state learns how to fund itself during panic, that knowledge never really goes away. It just